Welcome back to this lecture series titled Our Living National Constitution, Its History and Evolving Interpretation. Again, I am Edward J. Dodson. This is lecture 3 in the series titled Cracks in the Constitution Lead to Civil War and a Prolonged Struggle Over Principles of Liberty and Justice for All. We have established thus far in this lecture series that the government formed under the Constitution did not fully satisfy a significant number of Americans. The philosopher Mortimer J. Adler succinctly described some of the main cracks in the document's contents. He writes, "The young disfranchised by their age, the women disfranchised by their gender, the blacks disfranchised by their enslavement, and a large number of white male adults disfranchised by their lack of sufficient property to pay a poll tax, made up that portion of the population who were not members of the people. They were, in fact, an overwhelming majority." It was not very long after ratification of the Bill of Rights amendments that an 11th Amendment was deemed necessary. During the debates over ratification, opponents expressed concern over the Judiciary Act of 1789, which gave the U.S. Supreme Court jurisdiction over suits between states and citizens of other states. In a case regarding a contract for supplies between a contractor in South Carolina and the state of Georgia, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that the state could be sued under Article 3. To prevent this from ever happening again, the 11th Amendment was proposed during the first meeting of the Congress following the decision. This amendment limited the application of Article 3, Section 2 to clarify that the judicial power of the United States did not extend to any lawsuit brought against one of the states by a citizen of another state or by citizens or subjects of a foreign nation. It reads, "The judicial power of the United States shall not be construed to extend to any suit in law or equity, commenced or prosecuted against one of the United States by citizens of another state or by citizens or subjects of any foreign state." In the election of 1796, John Adams narrowly defeated Thomas Jefferson to become the second president of the United States. Because Jefferson finished with the second highest number of electoral votes, he became vice president. The fact that Adams and Jefferson were opponents started debate over how to correct the system by which the offices were filled. 4 years later, Adams and Jefferson again faced one another. However, this time, Aaron Burr and Jefferson finished ahead of Adams. The election of Jefferson then required the intervention of Alexander Hamilton to break the tie between Jefferson and Burr on the 36th ballot in the Electoral College. Legislators now realized the election process needed to be changed. Following ratification of the 12th Amendment in 1804, each member of the Electoral College was now required to cast one vote for president and a separate vote for vice president. Note that this did not eliminate the possibility of the president and vice president coming from different political parties. What also remained unresolved until the 22nd Amendment was whether any person should be permitted to stand for election to the office of president for a third consecutive term. The amendment does not apply to the office of vice president, for which there is no limit on the number of terms one can serve. Other possible conflicts remain, such as whether after serving 2 terms as president, a former president is eligible to run for the office of vice president. In 1821, there came an extraordinary opportunity for reflection. The notes of the Constitutional Convention taken by Robert Yates of New York were published. Yates had been a fierce anti-federalist, attending fewer than 7 of the 16 weeks. This prompted James Madison, already at work organizing his own papers, to work even harder on the project. Those interested in the details were required to wait until 1840 for Hamilton's notes to finally be published. This edited edition by Pepperdine University professor Gordon Lloyd was published in 2014, based on Madison's daily diary of the events and his reflections afterward. Professor Lloyd provides an important insight into Madison's motivation for completing the work. Madison was responding to an urgent public interest in what happened behind the closed doors of the convention. The framers were dying, but the story had not yet been properly told. Madison wanted to tell the story while choosing the time of its release. Because of a joint resolution of Congress calling for the records of the convention to be gathered and published, Madison had been asked in 1818 by John Quincy Adams, then Secretary of State, to turn over his notes. Madison had refused. He said that he did not want them to be used in public debates then ongoing over the powers of the judiciary and whether and how to limit slavery. He told Adams he did not want his account published until after his death. A balance of sectional power had been maintained in 1820 when Maine was admitted as a free state and Missouri as a slave state. Additionally, the so-called Missouri Compromise prohibited slavery in the Louisiana Territory north of the 3630 latitude line, excepting Missouri. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams passed into history on the same day, the 4th of July, 1826. Defense of the Constitution and the founding system of governance was now almost solely left to James Madison, who had retired to his plantation, Montpelier, after his presidential term ended in 1817. He was now age 66. He remained engaged with the nation's politics, however. Looking into the future and foreseeing the divisions to come over slavery, Madison became a founding member of the American Colonization Society, the purpose of which was to expatriate free blacks to Africa. He came up with the idea of selling public lands in the West to raise money to compensate enslavers and fund the expatriation of free blacks. Madison died in 1836. Once again, controversy over federal tariffs had become an issue with constitutional implications. Manufacturing concerns in the northeastern and middle states pushed for higher tariffs on imported goods to give themselves a price advantage. Southern cotton producers, heavily dependent on trade with British producers, rose up against the measure, fearing retaliatory tariffs against cotton and other commodities. Part of New England also opposed the tariffs. After close affirming votes in the House and Senate, John Quincy Adams signed the measure into law in May of 1828. Adams then lost the presidential election to Andrew Jackson, and the vice president now became John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. Calhoun had written a document published anonymously arguing that the federal union was voluntary and that the states had the right and authority to reject federal laws counter to state interests. This resurrected the doctrine of nullification long ago argued by Thomas Jefferson. Andrew Jackson sought to reduce the nation's debt, so he did not act to reduce or eliminate the tariff during his first years in office. Outcries from affected states resulting in legislation in 1832 reduced the tariff on some imports. Not satisfied, South Carolina passed an ordinance of nullification, refusing to continue collecting the tariffs. Congress authorized Jackson to use force if necessary, but also scaled back the tariffs significantly. South Carolina complied, but also declared the legislation authorizing Jackson to use force to be null. Thus, there was no resolution to regional differences over the degree to which sovereignty for individual states existed under the Constitution. Nullification would be utilized by slave states committed to defending the right of a white person to enslave a person of color. However, as Professor Sitterman reminds us, certain northern interests and profits depended on enslaved labor working in the cotton fields of the South. After the invention of the cotton gin, production of the white gold of the South skyrocketed. In 1796, cotton amounted to 2.2% of U.S. exports. By 1820, the commodity accounted for 32% of exports. By 1831, nearly 50% of global cotton was produced in the United States, and more than 70% of British cotton imports came from America. Cotton production in the United States increased tenfold between 1820 and 1860. John C. Calhoun, a lifelong defender of slavery, resigned in 1832 as Jackson's vice president and was elected to the U.S. Senate. As Calhoun thought about what might save the Union, he argued that the northern states should elect one president and the southern states a second president to govern jointly. Near death in March of 1850, his final speech in the Senate was read by James Mason of Virginia. How can the Union be saved? There is but one way by which it can with any certainty, and that is by a full and final settlement on the principle of justice of all the questions at issue between the two sections. If you who represent the stronger portion cannot agree to settle them on the broad principle of justice and duty, say so, and let the states we both represent agree to separate and part in peace. If you are unwilling we should part in peace, tell us so, and we shall know what to do when you reduce the question to submission or resistance. A decade later, the state legislators of the southern red states voted to leave the Union, and the representatives in the U.S. Congress departed from the Capitol and returned home. Whether secession could have been done peacefully by constitutional means was never tested. In 1869, the Supreme Court ruled that unilateral secession is unconstitutional and that the ordinances of secession and all the acts of the legislatures within seceding states intended to give effect to such ordinances were absolutely null. Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase, in deciding the case, wrote, "The union of the states never was a purely artificial and arbitrary relation. It began among the colonies and grew out of common origin, mutual sympathies, kindred principles, similar interests, and geographical relations. It was confirmed and strengthened by the necessities of war, and received definite form and character and sanction from the Articles of Confederation. By these the Union was solemnly declared to be perpetual." And when these articles were found to be inadequate to the exigencies of the country, the Constitution was ordained to form a more perfect union. It is difficult to convey the idea of indissoluble unity more clearly than by these words. What can be indissoluble if a perpetual union made more perfect is not? On the 12th of April, 1861, forces of the Confederacy opened fire on the federal fort in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. President Abraham Lincoln declared the southern states in rebellion. Whether one refers to the conflict as a civil war or as the war between the states, the consequences have to some degree continued to this very day. The wording of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, adopted in 1868, left the door open for future challenges. Section 1 reads, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." Note the wording regarding citizenship. All persons are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. One now must consider, when deciding where to reside, the laws in place in a given state that might affect you as an individual. What, for example, is the state law relating to marriage with someone of the same gender, or the state law relating to a choice to terminate a pregnancy? These are constitutional matters associated with a supremacy clause and its interpretation by the sitting Supreme Court. What strikes me as interesting because of the mobility of our population is whether we are in reality citizens of a state or simply residents. With the war ended and the political power of Southern whites temporarily unraveled, there was significant support in the North for the confiscation and redistribution of land. Professor Satterman explains the objective was to break the feudal power of the planter aristocracy and replace it with a more egalitarian distribution of property. Pennsylvanian Thaddeus Stevens made the connection between such a program of land redistribution and the future stability of the Union and democracy. It is impossible that any practical equality of rights can exist where a few thousand men monopolize the whole landed property. The larger the number of small proprietors, the more safe and stable the government. As the landed interest must govern, the more it is subdivided and held by independent owners, the better. Note his assertion, as the landed interest must govern. There is enormous political power associated with control over a nation's land and resources, a power that only intensifies as population increases and the demand for land and resources increases. Henry George was to turn this observation into a global call for systemic reform. In an address delivered in San Francisco, California on the 4th of July, 1877, Henry George expressed optimism that the nation was beginning to heal after such a devastating war, yet he expressed deep concerns over the future of the American democracy. Republican government is yet but an experiment. That it has worked well so far determines nothing. That Republican institutions would work well under the social conditions of the youth of the Republic, cheap land, high wages, and little distinction between rich and poor, there was never any doubt, for they were working well before. The doubt about Republican institutions is as to whether they will work when population becomes dense, wages low, and a great gulf separates rich and poor. Henry George anticipated that such a time was coming in the not very distant future when the disappearance of the frontier and access to free or very inexpensive land would threaten the republic. Rapid industrialization accelerated growth in the size of the wealth pie, but also its redistribution into the hands of the landed and others who enjoyed monopolistic privileges. A real question is whether we have today finally reached that level of income and wealth concentration that cannot be sustained, that will trigger systemic collapse and will bring on a non-democratic regime. At the time Henry George was delivering his address, the United States was still struggling to emerge from the economic depression that began late in 1873. The same causes would repeat again and again every couple of decades, poorly understood and too often responded to in ways that only made matters worse. During the previous decade, Europeans had invested heavily in bonds issued by expanding railroad corporations in the United States. A financial panic began in Europe, causing bondholders to offer far more bonds for sale than there were interested buyers. So the bond values fell. Railroads dependent on borrowing to continue expansion could not meet their expenses, became insolvent, and went bankrupt. Bondholders simply lost their investments. The panic spread to the United States. The huge New York City bank Jay Cooke & Company had also been a huge investor in railroad bonds. When this bank failed, depositors went to their local bank and began to pull out whatever was on deposit. Nearly 100 banks quickly became insolvent and closed their doors. There was one other consequence of great significance described by Professor Satterman. The Panic and Depression of 1873 shifted attention to monetary and labor debates in the North and enabled the South to backslide into white supremacy. Americans were beginning to think in terms of scarcity. that the country was becoming overpopulated and that at least some restriction on immigration was needed. Again, Professor Satareman. Even in the 1840s, nativists organized against the growing number of Irish and German immigrants in America. By the economic crisis of the 1870s, opinion turned against the Chinese, whom many saw as racially inferior, culturally different, and economically threatening. In 1882, for the first time in American history, Congress passed a law restricting immigration by race and nationality, the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was becoming clear to some that migration into and settlement of the vast lands of the West was an insufficient safety valve against the constitutional and systemic weaknesses inherent in the American system. The warning had been sent by historian Frederick Jackson Turner. The future had arrived all too quickly. In 1911, Turner wrote, "The transformations through which the United States is passing in our own day are so profound, so far-reaching, that it is hardly an exaggeration to say that we are witnessing the birth of a new nation in America. The revolution in the social and economic structure of this country during the past 2 decades is comparable to what occurred when independence was declared and the Constitution was formed, or to the changes wrought by the era which began half a century ago, the era of Civil War and Reconstruction. It is taking less than a generation to write the chapter which began with the disappearance of the line of the frontier, the last chapter in the history of the colonization of the United States, the conclusion to the annals of its pioneer democracy." Professor Satareman offers his own assessment of the safety valve theory. The safety valve theory suffered from 2 problems. First was the closing of the frontier. Without expansive lands to the west, America could not ensure the equal economic opportunity that the founders' vision of Republican government required. The second problem with the safety valve theory was that it was a fiction. Greeley's advice, "Go west, young man," and the Homestead Act might have encouraged some wage workers to move west, but the real trends in the late 19th century were away from agriculture and toward urbanization and industrialization. And historian Frederick Lewis Allen adds another important detail to the story. One thing that was happening was that the good American land was filling up, but now the frontier was closed, and though there were still chances for a man to arrive in the West with nothing and then to achieve comfort, these chances seemed to be dwindling. No sooner had the American people began to feel somewhat secure about the nation's economy than another contraction and financial crisis occurred. Problems in Argentina spread panic among investors. The property markets in South Africa and Australia collapsed. New silver mines in the western United States produced huge amounts of silver, and the price of silver fell. And once again, highly leveraged railroads defaulted to bondholders. Depositors pulled their cash from the banks. Foreign holders of U.S. currency turned to the U.S. Treasury to convert their paper money into gold. In 1894, Henry George offered his perspective on the situation in an article that appeared in the North American Review. What do we mean when we say that it is scarcity of employment from which the masses are suffering? Not what we mean when we say of the idle rich that they suffer from want of employment. There is no scarcity of the need for work when so many are suffering for the want of things that work produces, when all of us would like more, and all but a very few of us could advantageously use more of those things. Nor do we mean that there is scarcity of ability to work or willingness to work. Nor yet do we mean that there is scarcity of the natural materials and forces necessary for work. They are as abundant as they ever were or ever will be until the energy radiated by the sun upon our globe loses its intensity. May it not be seen from our greatest cities to our newest territories in the speculation which has everywhere been driving up the price of land, that is to say, the toll that the active factor in all production must pay for permission to use the indispensable passive factor. Professor Satareman succinctly summarizes Henry George's message and influence. In Progress and Poverty, one of the best-selling books of the time, Henry George argued that the problem of the age wasn't the divide between labor and capital. The problem was land monopolists, who did no work but took in unearned income from rents. As progress increased, machines, development, productivity, poverty increased too, because the monopolists increased the rent they charged. The solution was a single tax, an extremely high land tax that would restrict the emergence of a rentier class of land monopolists. With such a tax, he argued, progress would reduce poverty rather than accompany it. Does Professor Satareman concur with Henry George, or perhaps disagree with George's analysis? He does not say. George is included as one of the many advocates of a unique program of reform. The story Professor Satareman tells moves on in other directions. In 1886, Henry George's book titled Protection or Free Trade was published. George added his system-changing arguments against tariffs and other restraints on trade to the war against landlordism. In the U.S. House of Representatives in 1890, Democratic Congressman Tom L. Johnson from Ohio conceived of the idea of getting Henry George's book into the congressional record. Johnson and 5 other congressmen each read a section of the book as part of their remarks in the tariff debate. More than 1,200,000 copies were printed and distributed. As Henry George Jr. later recalled, the entire country was for the time turned into debating clubs with protection or free trade for the subject matter. Importantly, the investigations and writings of free traders greatly raised public support for the reduction or even elimination of tariffs. The United States was now an industrial power the equal of Britain, its industries able to compete with anyone. However, the tariff revenue would have to be replaced, and there were important proposals already on the table awaiting serious consideration, such as the possibility of directly taxing income. Britain had embraced free trade since the 1860s. To be sure, opposition was ongoing, and Joseph Chamberlain launched a major campaign in favor of imperial preference at the turn of the century in retaliation for increased tariffs imposed by the United States against British goods. In defense of free trade, Winston Churchill crossed the floor of the House of Commons to join the Liberals in 1904. Then, in 1906, the Liberals won in a landslide election. British citizens had voted for cheaper goods over protection arguments made in defense of the empire. Rising opposition to tariffs in the United States was strengthened by information published by Thomas Sherman and George Holmes that the top 9% of the population held 70% of the nation's wealth. In response, in 1894, Congress passed a corporate income tax, but the Supreme Court struck it down as an assault on capital. However, the political winds were changing direction, and as the United States began to emerge from relative isolation on the world stage, the need for revenue would generate intense battles over a wide range of social, economic, and political issues. And with that, we reach the end of Lecture 3.